Hello, and welcome to Generation Cult, a show about people who grew up in controlling groups and what happened to them after they left. I'm Dhyana, and this is season 4. That's right, we're back for another season, and I know I need to stop saying at the end of each season that I don't know if we're going to come back, because this keeps happening. I just wasn't sure if there was a need for the show anymore, to be honest, because there are so many great cult podcasts out there, and I'm really happy about that. The more we can get this topic out there in the public, being discussed in a healthy manner, the better. But I thought it might be time to leave it to those with more resources to advertise and release episodes more regularly than I've been able to. However, people are still reaching out to me. They're finding episodes, relating to them, finding them helpful, regardless of when they have come out, and have expressed that they want more. So here we are. For this season, we are recording new episodes, but they are going to be released sporadically, kind of release them as we can. For this episode, we're going to be speaking to Grace, who reached out to me recently to show me her own pretty awesome podcast about the cult that she grew up in. She did years of research for it and has new episodes coming out right now. Grace was born into a fundamentalist Christian group referred to as the Geftakys Assembly, but she and her family left when she was young. We're going to talk to her about her experience with the group, what life was like after she left, and what inspired her to go back and interview former members to create the project she's now presenting to the public. Hi, Grace. Welcome and thanks for being here.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. This is very exciting. So my name is Grace, and I was born into the Geftakys Assembly. It is a group that was established in Southern California, specifically in Fullerton, from 1972 until 2003. About 1972. And we left when I was 9.
Again, thank you for being here. And you have your own podcast. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? What's it called?
Yeah, so it's called In God's Name, an unseen cult, or just In God's Name is kind of how I refer to it. I spent some time interviewing former members, and I've kind of recognized a pattern and decided to turn that into a podcast for the public to kind of share a shared experience that people felt very alone in. So that was really important to me.
So what inspired you to go back and do research and get working on this?
Yeah, so it was like a combination of factors. I actually didn't know that I was born into this group that was specifically a cult until I was 26 in 2020. And it took some time to process for myself, but I just still didn't fully understand because there's not a lot of people talking about being in this group. And at the same time, I was hoping to get into grad school for history. So I thought, what better way than to start to put together an archival collection of oral histories? So I started just reaching out to people I remembered and interviewing them, doing like the story of their life kind of a thing. So yeah, that's how I ended up kind of building this huge project that got a lot bigger than I expected.
So it's out now. You're releasing new episodes as we speak.
Mhm.
What's the response been like?
So it's interesting because I think overall it's been a very positive response. I do have some people here and there that kind of slide into my messages or, whatever, that are kind of unhappy about it.
Like people who've been in the group?
Yes, people who were in the group kind of like wanting to argue with me about theology. And, I'm just not interested in that.
Yeah.
But it's so funny because people aren't like, a lot of the times people don't directly tell me, but like people in my life will be like, oh my gosh, I talked to so and so and they were telling me how much they love it, or something like that. So through the grapevine, I've gotten very good responses.
Oh, that's great. What about just the general public? Like, have you had people who had nothing to do with the group that just came across it and were like, wow, I didn't know this?
Yeah.
Or has that mostly just been people who had some sort of association with it?
So it is a lot of association, but I do have some just kind of random people that are interested in learning about cults contact me to tell me that they like hadn't thought about cults in the way that I was presenting it. And it was a new kind of experience for them to see it in a more like empathetic way, through a more empathetic lens, rather than as sensationalized as sometimes cult podcasts get.
I really like that. I think more people are approaching the concept of cults in a more empathetic way, looking at the people who got involved and why, as opposed to like, oh, look at this crazy big thing that happened. So I liked that about your podcast. Just speaking specifically about one of the episodes, I happened to listen to your episode 4 on International Women's Day, which I guess was ironic, if that's the right word, because the episode was about wife training, which was pretty intense. I guess just to give people an idea of what they're in for, do you mind briefly explaining what that is? What is wife training?
Oh my goodness. Yes, absolutely. What a day to listen to that, by the way. Yeah. So, wife training is something that in my research, it seems like it was coined by Virginia Fugate. It is a way for men specifically to lead their wives to be obedient and kind of shed their sense of self, which sounds horrible, and it is horrible. It was something that the assembly did. They would have like obedience exercises where I think in the podcast I described a couple incidents where a husband would throw his keys on the ground and have his wife pick them up and hand them back to him, and he would just keep doing that. And that was just a practice of obedience. And there was another man who sent his wife to the corner and back randomly just to make sure she would do it. And that's rooted in a verse in Ephesians about wives submit to your husbands in all things. They conveniently ignore the next line, which is husbands love your wives as God loved the church, kind of a thing. They don't really focus on that part, but so submitting to your husband was really, really, really important in the assembly.
Let's talk a little bit more about this group and give people an idea of what you grew up in and what we're actually talking about and what your podcast is about. So why don't you give me a description of the group in general, if there is a simple way to describe it? I know it's often a little bit hard to do this in simple terms, but if you want to give it a try.
Yeah, no, I actually think the assembly is very unique in that it is so straightforward. It was a fundamentalist Christian cult, and there were over 75 sister churches across the United States and internationally, even, which is wild. But it was all run by this one man, George Geftakys, and his wife, Betty. And George traveled a lot. And so he had direct influence on every single one of these sister churches. And there was a lot of control. Yeah, it was like an extreme form of fundamentalist Christian where they take the Bible and they just extrapolate it.
What was the group setup like? Did people live communally? Were people located all over? Was it just kind of in one area? What was kind of, I guess, the geography of it?
So they had communal homes. They considered these communal homes like training homes. So basically, when you were of college age, is kind of when adults would be recruited into this group. And also, like, if you're growing up in the group and you reach college age, you would also enter a training home. They called these brothers and sisters homes. They would be gender specific, where they kind of trained you to be an adult within the assembly. But once you got married, a lot of the times you would move into your own personal family home, unless the leaders decided that you needed additional training, in which case you would be in another training home for the couple, and they would help you raise your children with like an elder kind of person training you actively. But yeah, they bought houses just like in suburbs, which is very, very interesting to me. A lot of people didn't even buy their homes, they rented it because there was some verse about not being in debt. I'm not quite sure exactly the verse. Yeah, so
That's interesting.
like an interesting hybrid of communal and non-communal living.
Huh. And this was all located in Southern California?
So it was established in Southern California, but there was, Midwest assemblies that had brothers and sisters homes, and there was Pacific Northwest, and there was some on the East Coast. They were really all over the place.
So how did your parents get involved?
So my parents, they were already dating by the time they found the assemblies, but they joined in college. It was like a Bible study, like an outreach that was happening on their college campus. And so they went to like a Bible study, and I guess it just really, really resonated with them, the sense of community and how dedicated they were to really diving into the scripture. And like they seemed to be having these really in-depth conversations about like the Lord. But their situation was kind of unique in that they were already together. So they weren't really set up in the same way that a lot of couples were set up in the assembly.
So there was arranged marriages in the assembly.
Basically, yeah. It was like a man would go to a leading brother and say, I'm interested in spending time with so and so. And the leading brother could either say yes or no. They could like totally reject, like, no, that's not in God's plan for you. Or if it was in God's plan, according to the leading brother, they would spend like an hour together a month in like a group setting and then decide if they were going to get married or not.
Okay, but your parents were already together when they
Right.
came in, so
So
it was
they couldn't
already
do that.
okay, I guess.
Yeah. They didn't have that
Yeah.
authority yet.
Okay, okay, and so then you were born
Mhm.
and grew up in it.
Mhm.
Were they living communally when you were born? Like, do you remember, I mean, obviously you don't remember when you were born, but do you remember anything about growing up in this group?
Yeah, I remember a lot. I'm actually the youngest of 5, and, so we didn't live communally because of that. We had too big of a family to do that. I do remember a lot from growing up that way. Obviously, I don't remember too much about there's a concept called child training within the Geftakys Assembly, but it happens in infancy. So you don't really remember I don't remember anything from being trained, but I remember kind of the effects as I was, cognizant.
Talk more about that.
Yeah.
Tell me more about child training.
So child training is probably more horrific than wife training, unfortunately. It's based on a lot of biblical writing about using a rod on your children, lots of spanking. But we had this thing, we had mats, which are basically like these little pads they put on the floor, kind of like a dog bed. And they had these workshops to kind of teach new mothers how to do this, where they'd put you on your mat as like literally not even a year old, just like a few months. They would put something shiny or like a toy or a treat outside of your mat. And if you reached off of it, they would swat your hand with a rod.
Mm.
And they did that over and over and over again to make sure you knew to stay within these bounds on your mat. The sole purpose for that was for keeping children still and quiet and in one place during meetings so that parents weren't leaving the meetings and missing out on what George or whoever was leading had to say. So we had that, and then there was this concept called immediate obedience. So it's basically like your parents should tell you only once this one thing, and if you don't, it doesn't really matter if you comply later. Like maybe the second time they asked, the fact that you didn't comply the first time resulted in a punishment, and it was always physical punishments. It was spanking, and the rods kind of got bigger and harder as you got older.
Oh.
Yeah, not
Uh,
great.
yeah. So you were the youngest, and so you had siblings who had, I mean, how long had your other siblings been through this?
They were all raised this way. Yeah, we were all born within the assembly. My oldest brother is 10 and a half years older than me. So by the time I was born, he was getting close to 11. It's interesting. You see the effects of this on like a sliding scale because with their first child, they were the most enthused, they were the most entrenched in this group, and more willing to like be a little harsher, I think. But, I think by the time I was born, some doubts were kind of creeping in. And while I still got my fair share of the child training and spankings and physical punishments, I don't think it was as severe as like my older siblings experienced.
Mm.
Mhm.
Did any of your siblings rebel at any point?
All of us. Yeah. I mean, maybe
Okay.
except for me. Yeah. My oldest brother has been through a lot, absolutely. My brother Steve ran away from home. My sister, I remember there being constant fighting with my parents growing up. And something that's interesting that happens I think being the youngest, especially, I would watch all these interactions and I would make mental notes of like what to avoid doing to avoid getting in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm very perceptive. Even to this day, I can kind of sense when people are upset or angry or irritated or, all of
Mm-hmm.
that because I spent so much energy trying to protect myself.
Yeah, I relate to that.
So, one of the things that the assembly did, and I talk about it a bit in my podcast, is that they had the system of like sharing information where basically people would report back to leadership when they saw you were doing something wrong
Mm.
and wasn't to like gain status or anything. It was really just to push somebody down.
Mm-hmm.
Like below them. But in the school, there was this teacher that did something very similar with the children, and it was called court.
Court.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so it was basically after any kind of recess, we would all come back inside and she would say, "Okay, it's time for court. Is there anything anybody needs to say?" And it was an open forum for this person did this and these three people saw it happen.
Oh
And
my God.
so they were
And how
built.
old were the kids when?
This was kindergarten, 1st
Oh my
grade, 2nd
God.
grade.
Oh,
Yes.
so
So
really, that's like really bad behavior modeling as well. For
1,000%. And it's so interesting that they were really setting us up for exactly what the adults were doing to each other, of ostracizing each other for the sake of just saving ourselves by putting the target on somebody else. And that's one thing that I definitely carried, as a small child. That influenced me a lot because I remember being like 7 or 8, and my mom would come home or my dad would come home and I'd go running to the door. Even if I was just making it up, I would go running to the door and, one of my siblings did something bad, so I would say it. I would get to them first because that was a safety net. And that's something that I regret every day because the result of that is physical punishment. But I was saving myself. It's so awful the things that they trained into us. So,
yeah, I mean, you were literally trained to do that even in school.
yeah.
Which and also, little kids just, like, tattle anyway. I mean,
Hmm.
now being a mom and having a I mean, my child is 13 now, but I remember that age, like, kindergarten, like, age 5, 6, 7 going up. They just tattle anyway, so you usually are like, "Well, okay, but it's not nice to tattle." So I can't even imagine being like, "Okay, do you have anything to report today on your friends? Stand up in front of the class."
Hmm.
I can't even imagine being like, "Oh, tell me more," like, encourage that even more would.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
that's
And
really too bad. I mean, do you remember the kind of things the kids would even stand up in this court and tell
like,
about?
yeah, it'd be like John threw a foam brick at me or, like just like,
It's like, "Of
like
course he did, he's 6."
yeah, exactly. Or like this person said like gosh, or this person did finger guns during recess. Like it was just everything. It was the silliest things, but at the same time, you're building a lack of trust
Yeah,
in your
yeah.
community with children, like children couldn't trust anyone because the adults were always punishing them and the children were always tattling, and literally nothing was safe. Nowhere was safe. School wasn't safe. Home wasn't safe. It was just protective mode.
Yeah, that's really scary.
Yeah,
Hard to
yeah.
feel safe. So, do you have any first memories? First, what is this? Something about my family's different, or something about this is odd. I don't know. Any first
Like
like,
question marks.
like yeah, like what's going on here?
To be honest, I don't remember having any question marks. I have a lot of memories growing up this way. I was thinking about it yesterday and I have this like distinct memory of being so proud of myself in a Bible study that I was able to successfully pretend to be asleep on my mat to the point where Bible study was over. My parents just kind of folded my mat around me like a little taco and like carried me to the car rather than wake me up. And while that's like so sweet, they didn't want to disturb me. They wanted to let me sleep. At the same time, pretending to be asleep to avoid being in trouble is like so sad. It was safer to be asleep than to be awake a lot of the times growing up.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, and I
really
still
sad.
struggle with that, when I get super, super overwhelmed or stressed, I get super tired, like, my body just is like, "You should probably just go to sleep," kind of a thing, and I don't think that's normal.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. How cut off were you? Were you interacting with other people or were you mostly just around other people who were going through the same thing?
So, up until the group fell apart when I was 9, we were very isolated. They had a school, they had an elementary school, and we went to that school. So, we were only ever interacting really with the people in the group, with the exception of like one neighborhood kid that my parents like were fine with me hanging out with. But I guess I didn't think it was weird enough to bring up, any of the stuff I was going through. So, we never even touched on that. And then he moved away. And so,
When you're 9 and below,
yeah.
I mean, you just think it's just that's the way things are. So, yeah, I was gonna ask why your parents left, but it was because the group fell apart. What ended up happening
Yeah,
with your
so
group?
the internet happened to my group, which is lovely. We love to see it. A few former members got
Mm.
together and assembled, as many former member stories as they could and, some other documents, and they uploaded it to a website. They built a website with a anonymous forum attached to the website, and they email blasted it to
Mm.
everyone. Yeah, and they also,
Oh,
like,
I'm loving
email
this.
blasted it to
That's
teens
great.
that were in the group. So, when your teen comes to you and they have all these questions, you kinda have to read through what they're looking at. So a lot of information came to light. The leader's son had been physically abusive for, like, 30 years to his wife and his children,
Oh.
and the leader himself was having multiple affairs with like a bunch of different young women in the assembly, and he would always cite that it was like a vision from God that they were meant to be married after his wife passed away.
Ugh, of course. Come
Of
on.
course.
Jeez.
Yeah, so that's what happened.
It's like if you can't prove it, just, bring God into it and
Absolutely,
you know,
yeah.
so so after all this stuff came out, what did people just start leaving or
Yeah, so there was like, from what people have told me, in Fullerton in the main flagship church, there was a kind of like a town hall type thing where everybody came in, and it was supposed to be a time to like address all the things, but I guess it was very scripted. They had like pre-prepared questions and answers for like kind of what was going on, and so a lot of people were not satisfied with that, and they left. The people who tried to hang on hung on for a few years, but they tried to present hanging on as it was never about George.
Mhm.
It was never about this leader, and it was. So
Mhm.
it just couldn't keep going.
Oh man, I so relate to this. I'm sorry, I don't mean to make this about me, but that happened to my
No.
group that I grew up in. Yeah, I mean, it was a little bit different because I'm old and there wasn't the internet at the time. So it was like a lot of gossip and then it was an actual newspaper article that came out. But it was kind of the same thing like, oh no, it wasn't about the leader, but then, it kind of was because everything kind of fell apart after that. But yeah. Yeah, wow. Well, that must have been pretty disruptive for your family. Was your family one of the, "Oh, we're sticking around because it was about the ideas, not the leader," or like what side was your family on in all of this?
So I don't really know. I think my dad wanted to stay. And my mom didn't want to stay. She needed to go. And so I don't know exactly what transpired, but we left. Yeah.
Okay. And do you remember that part at all? Like, do you remember any turmoil over that, or were you too young for that to really register?
I think I don't know that I was too young for it to register, but I think I was in such survival mode that I was just doing whatever my parents wanted to do. I didn't know about any of the stuff that had happened at all. Suddenly, I'm 9 years old and I'm not going to the school I used to go to, and I'm not going to the church I used to go to. I'm going to a new school and a new church,
Yeah.
and everything's suddenly very unfamiliar, and I didn't know why that was happening at all.
Like, how did that feel? Like, did it feel wrong, or did it just feel like, "Oh, going on to the new thing"?
Oh, it felt weird. It was really strange, especially going into public school. My grade was a 3rd and 4th grade class together combined in the cult school. And, we had, I think, 6 or 7 students in the class. It was like such a small, I knew everyone and I had known everyone my whole life. And suddenly I'm in this school and there's like 25 students and I'm supposed to
Mm.
find my desk on my own and I didn't know anyone. And I remember my first day of public school, I just started sobbing because I
Aw.
couldn't find my desk and everybody was like chit-chatting with each other
Yeah.
and I was just standing there and I had no idea what was happening.
Oh, that's yeah, that's kind of scary.
Yeah, it was very,
Yeah.
very scary. And then as far as like going to a new church, I don't even remember until I was like going to the teen services. I think I was so used to just completely blanking out for like hours and hours and hours at a
Oh,
time.
like disassociating?
Yes, uh-huh.
Mm,
That I don't
mhm.
remember like kids services at all, besides that like we watched Veggie Tales every once in a while and I thought that was fun.
And so what was this new church that they went to? Was it didn't have anything to do with
No,
the old
it was
one?
just a normal evangelical Christian church. They played instruments, which was new for me. I wasn't used to music being involved in church at all. And they had like fun activities and like I got to be away from my parents during church services, whereas before we all sat kind of in between my parents so that if we did anything wrong, we'd get a little pinch or a little flick or stuff like that. Yeah, but suddenly I was like independent and watching Veggie Tales and
So something about this experience obviously stuck with you enough for you to go back and work on this podcast. What about this affected your life enough to make you wanna go back and research this?
You know, all of it. That's the crazy thing about not knowing what was happening when it all fell apart. My family never openly spoke about it. Nobody ever talked to me about it. I think my older siblings kind of each one by one discovered the nature of the group we were in and kind of fought with my parents about it, but I just thought that they were fighting because that was normal to me. And so these ideas that were presented about women and about children, they're very insidious. When that's your foundation, when that's all you knew, you keep carrying that. And all of it stuck with me. I was a terrible student all through high school, even because I didn't really believe that I could be anything other than a wife. And once a teacher kind of presented like, "Hey, you could probably keep going," then I was like, "Oh, like, I guess I didn't even think that that was, like, an option on the table for me." I was in emotionally abusive relationships because as a woman, I wasn't supposed to have a voice in my head, these are the ideas that were there for me. So it took a really, really long time to like coax myself out of these ideas that I had about who I was and who I was allowed to be. And a lot of therapy.
Therapy's good.
Yeah, therapy is very good. Yeah, and I mean, even up till college, I had a one professor really, really, really believe in me, and it just shook me to my core. And I didn't understand it, but I was so moved that I just wanted to make that professor really proud. And so I kept going, and I graduated college with a crazy high GPA, and all my professors love me and like still talk to them. And I'm gonna hopefully keep going with like a PhD.
Mhm.
And yeah, when I think about who I was after the group, it makes me really sad because she had no hope. I thought I was going to be victim to live without a voice, without real unconditional love like for the rest of my life because I thought that was my purpose as a woman.
Those are really, really unhealthy messages to be raised with. Even if you get
Mhm.
out as young as age 9, that stuff can really stick with you. I'm just really
Mhm.
glad you realized your worth and you had some supportive professors, and I can't help but ask about your siblings. How did they end up? Did they go on and realize themselves and what they could do, or are they doing okay as well?
Yeah, I think we're all in different phases of healing. I think one of the things I'm most grateful for is like me and my sister specifically, we had a different kind of teachings than my brothers did. And I'm really grateful that I found, a husband that loves and supports me, and she did as well. And so I'm just so happy for for us. And yeah, my other siblings, they know who they are, and they're great people. They're strong people. smart people, and I think we believe in ourselves.
That's great. What's your parents' take on all this? Like, have you talked to them about what happened? Do they feel bad or I mean, what's their story with this whole situation?
It breaks my mom's heart. It does.
Mm.
I think she harbors a lot of guilt about everything that happened, how we were raised, the environment we were exposed to, the people we were exposed to. I think she does feel genuine remorse, and she's always listening to us, and she wants to hear what we think and what we feel. So she's done a lot in that regard. My dad, he's a very loving person, and at the same time, he's never let go of these kind of ideas. He is going to another fundamentalist Christian church. I wouldn't describe it as a cult, but it's fundamentalist. And so I think we argue a lot, especially with this podcast coming out. He thought that I'm like villainizing Christianity as a whole because to him this is what Christianity looks like because that's what the Bible says. And it's difficult. It's definitely difficult to kind of be rehashing all this stuff all the time with him specifically. I just don't think he sees the damage that it did.
Yeah, I was wondering what your family thought of you researching this and talking publicly. And yeah, it sounds like your dad isn't super excited about you doing this. What about your mom and your siblings and I don't know, your friends from the group? Are they supportive?
Yeah, yeah. My mom is super supportive. She's been like sending the link to the podcast to like everyone she knows from the
Aw.
group.
Oh, that's
Yeah, so she's
nice.
and they like are chatting about it, and she's gonna do like she keeps joking about doing like a little support group for moms.
Aw. Oh, that's
Um,
great. I love to hear that.
yeah,
I'm so glad.
yeah, and my siblings are also, really proud of me. They're listening to it. They're not talking to me too much about it because I think they're processing. This is all like very, again, we never talked about it. It was so like hush hush. It was just like never on the table to talk about. And so I think they're processing a lot of this information in the same way that I did when I first started doing this research and these interviews. So I'm just kind of giving them their space and letting them process how they need to.
Yeah, yeah. So you've been
Yeah.
working on this podcast a while. Like, when did you
Mhm.
actually start doing the actual research for it?
I started doing the research in 2021. I spent like a full year just interviewing people for this archival collection. And then in 2022 was when I decided that I think it could be a podcast. One thing that really stuck out to me in my interviews is everyone felt so, so, so alone.
Hmm.
There's like a level of shame. They felt like they had been tricked or maybe they were naive or something, but they never openly discussed it in the same way that my family never openly discussed it. And I just wanted them to know how many other people told me exactly the same stuff they told me. And that was so sad. It broke my heart to hear them feel so alone. And so that was a really intense motivating factor for me to start turning it into a podcast.
That's why I wanted to do this podcast. Feels so universal just across the board, like everyone who's experienced any kind of coercive group. They turn it back on themselves. They feel so ashamed and they don't want to talk about it. And it's like, well,
Mhm.
maybe if everyone talked about it, people wouldn't feel so
Yeah.
ashamed.
Yeah, no, I feel that way. I feel that way entirely as well. There's strength in admitting what you've overcome. I don't want people to look at it like I was naive or I was weak or I was silly or I was stupid or anything like that. What it is that you were open and you were trying to live your life and somebody took advantage of you as a person and you're incredible. You're incredible. You got out of that.
Exactly.
you know?
Exactly. Yeah.
And you're a whole different person since then, and, like, isn't that so amazing?
Yeah, I feel like abusers and people who take advantage, they get their power from other people's silence,
Mhm.
and they depend on other people being ashamed at being taken advantage of, and then they just get away with it.
Mhm.
Yeah, I feel like if other people are like, "Hey, I had that experience too. Wait a second. I'm not just the one
Yeah.
person. Like, wait, this has happened." Yeah, so
Yeah.
good. Well, great. I'm glad that you're doing your podcast. Let's say someone just stumbles across it and they don't have
Mhm.
anything to do with your group and what do you want people to learn?
I think I want them to know how easy it is. How easy it is to fall prey to these kinds of groups. And it's not any fault of the person who was a former member. It's so important to me to kind of restructure the way that we talk about cults. And it's not this like brilliant mastermind that's tricking all these silly people. It's people with trauma who are looking for community and looking for their place in the world at a really young and impressionable age. Where life is suddenly really scary because you're like an adult and you have to start making decisions, and they're presented this like loving space that has the answers. From their perspective, they had the answers. They had the answers to everything. And it's so easy because I think we've all been through that time in our lives where stuff's getting serious, like we're suddenly an adult, and how lovely it would be to have somebody give us the answers.
Yeah. Wouldn't it be nice if things were easy?
Yeah, so I think that's
I
it.
wish.
Wouldn't it be so nice if things were easy? Yeah. So I just really want people to remember when we're talking about cults that these are people and we're just like them. It's not as simple as some of the more sensationalized things would lead you to believe.
So true. What's the name of your podcast again, and where can people find it?
Yeah. So my podcast is called In God's Name, an Unseen Cult, and it is on Spotify and Apple. And that's it.
Thank you so much for your time and for sharing this. And thanks for doing a whole podcast yourself about your group. I love that people are getting out there and doing research and sharing about their own groups. I think it's so useful to get to learn that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. Thank you for this. This is an inspiration. Absolutely. And like, it's just great that people are talking. I love that. It's open and honest.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.